Hey everybody, Johnny the Queer POTUS here. Yesterday was Halloween, so happy Halloween. And tomorrow is Election Day. And I thought it might be interesting to talk about a great election from history, the election of 1864. This was Abraham Lincoln's battle for re-election. And by all accounts, he was going to lose. In this video, I'll be examining a single month in Abraham Lincoln's life, August 1864. We'll see how Lincoln dealt with the possibility of defeat, and we'll watch him struggle to see the cause of abolition through to its end. Our story begins 2 days shy of August, on the eve of a daring Union assault. In the early morning hours of July 30th, 1864, just outside Petersburg, Virginia, Brigadier General James Ledley's 1st Division was biding its time. The Army of the Potomac had spent the last month and a half unsuccessfully trying to take this critical railway junction. Petersburg was surrounded by a massive, heavily fortified trench line, manned by thousands of rebel soldiers. But in July, General Ambrose Burnside had approved an innovative plan to break through the enemy defenses. For 3 weeks, Union engineers dug a massive tunnel underneath the line and filled it with 8,000 pounds of explosives. A fuse was placed to set off the bomb at 3:30 a.m., after which Ledley's division would rush into the gap and take the town. The deadline came and went with no explosion, and the 1st Division became impatient. Across the way, a small, highly trained unit of U.S. colored troops sang a spiritual to calm their nerves. There had been an argument among general staff whether to have a USCT unit be part of the first wave. Some officers thought having the African-American unit lead this critical assault would provide a propaganda victory for black soldiers, much as the assault on Fort Wagner had done for the Massachusetts 54th. Burnside ultimately reversed himself and put the unit further back in the line. If this risky assault turned out to be a huge failure, Burnside didn't want to be accused of wasting black lives on a foolhardy mission. So it fell to Ledley's units of white soldiers to go in first. Around 4 a.m., word came back that the broken fuse had been repaired. The soldiers waited. Then, at 4:44, the tunnel ignited. The explosion killed 287 Confederates outright and left the remaining forces dumbfounded. But the incredible fiery display also stunned the Union troops. They stood frozen for 10 minutes before attacking, giving Confederates time to regroup. When Union soldiers finally began moving forward towards the gap, they saw that the explosion had produced a massive crater. Into the crater they charged, before they realized the trap they'd set for themselves. Confederate gunmen set up on the edge of the crater and fired into the mass of disorderly troops. When all was said and done, 4,000 Union soldiers lay dead, and no progress made whatsoever. Gruesome tales like these, which adorned the front pages of every journal in the first week of August 1864, reminded people that this war had dragged on for 4 years, and each new year was proving worse than the last. The election of 1864 was only 3 months away, and by all accounts, Lincoln was far behind. For the '64 campaign, Lincoln shed his Republican Party banner and ran on a bipartisan National Union ticket with a Southern Democrat, Andrew Johnson, as his VP. Whatever Lincoln's party affiliation, Americans understood one thing well. Re-electing Lincoln meant continuing the war. On the opposite side, the Democrats were set to nominate their candidate at their convention in late August, and Lincoln expected them to run a peace candidate. Whoever it might be, Lincoln's prospects were looking dim. Close friend and advisor David Davis reported on the public mood in Chicago, one of Lincoln's electoral strongholds.
People are getting tired of the war. Some of them can't see a ray of light. There is no note of any volunteering. There is faith in the administration, and yet You will hear whispering inquiries as to whether the plan they are pursuing is the best.
War weariness may have been eroding support for the president among voters, but Lincoln was focused on more practical concerns. Recruitment was way down. Back when the war started in 1861, young men fell over one another for the chance to sign up. But once the true horrific nature of the war revealed itself, the numbers of volunteers plummeted. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which opened the rolls of the military to black recruitment, had brought a much-needed 200,000 troops into the Army. Acts to encourage immigration loosened restrictions on new arrivals and brought yet more potential recruits in from Europe. But ultimately, Lincoln found he could not win the war without forcing people into service. The first attempts at a draft in the summer of 1863 sparked massive riots, many of which took a racial tone. In New York, scores of black folk were lynched by angry white mobs who refused to be drafted into a war for emancipation. Draftees were allowed to pay a substitute a $300 bounty to evade service, which exacerbated class tensions around the war effort. On July 4, 1864, Lincoln rang in the nation's 88th Independence Day by calling for 500,000 soldiers to be drafted into the Army. Stunted progress in the war effort boded even worse tidings for Lincoln's re-election prospects. Since June, the Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General Ulysses Grant, had been moving eastward across Virginia, desperately trying to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. Failed attempts at the Wilderness and Cold Harbor brought record numbers of casualties. In July, General Grant decided to focus his efforts on a critical supply junction southeast of Richmond called Petersburg. Arriving at Petersburg in June and surveying the massive fortifications, General Grant delayed his attack, failing to press the advantage before thousands of Confederate reinforcements arrived at the site. The resulting stalemate began what would become one of the longest sieges of the war. Furious at Grant's wavering, Lincoln fired off an aggressive letter to the general.
I repeat to you, the Army will not put itself south of the enemy lines unless you watch it every day and hour and force it. Hold on with a bulldog grip and chew and choke as much as possible.
If military failures, the draft, and war fatigue were cutting into Lincoln's support, political pressures mounted as well. On August 5th, Secretary of State William Henry Seward showed Lincoln a copy of the Wade-Davis Manifesto, recently published and making the rounds in the press. The manifesto was a sharply worded pamphlet written by two senators from Lincoln's own party, Ben Wade and Winter Davis. Lincoln had weeks earlier refused to sign their proposal for a post-war Reconstruction bill, considering it too harsh on the South. Wade and Davis responded by denouncing the president's use of the so-called pocket veto.
A more studied outrage on the legislative authority of the people has never been perpetrated.
That same day, Lincoln's monthly salary of $1,981.67 was deposited into his bank account, with a $101.66 deduction as required by Lincoln's recently enacted federal income tax law. Another reason to grumble about the president. On the 6th erupted another controversy, which would cut deeply into Lincoln's support, especially among war Democrats. Editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, had traveled to Niagara Falls, New York, carrying a letter from President Lincoln. On the Canadian side were 3 unofficial emissaries of the Confederacy, interested in negotiating terms of peace to end the war. When they opened the letter, they were quite shocked at one of Lincoln's peace terms.
To whom it may concern, any proposition which embraces the restoration of peace, the integrity of the whole Union, and the abandonment of slavery, will be received and considered by the executive government of the United States.
Until this point, most Americans had accepted the abandonment of slavery as a military necessity. Many came to reluctantly support the Emancipation Proclamation when it brought in hundreds of thousands of black troops. But abandonment of slavery as a condition of peace? Would Lincoln really allow the bloodshed to continue for the sake of slaves? Republicans, too, were squirming from Lincoln's apparent gaffe.
Nobody in New York doubts it, nor do I see anybody from other states who authorizes the slightest hope for success. The people are wild for peace.
Talk of convincing Lincoln to step down from the 1864 ticket abounded, even among party rank and file. Said one Republican operative,
"The Jonah of the ship of state is Lincoln. He should be thrown overboard."
On the night of the 11th, at Lincoln's summer residence at the Soldiers' Home, Lincoln vented frustrations about his party to Senator Carl Schurz of Ohio.
To have it said by men who have been my friends that I have been seduced by what they call a lust for power? Have they thought of our common cause when they try to break me down?
A few days after that meeting, while Lincoln was riding back to the Soldiers' Home, a would-be assassin took a shot at the president. Lincoln lost his hat in the exchange, but made it safely to his cottage. The next day, a guard found Lincoln's hat in the woods. There was a bullet hole in it. Perhaps more was at stake for Lincoln than just his office. Pressures from Republicans on Lincoln to withdraw from the 1864 ticket grew. On August 18th, a small conference was held in New York City. In attendance were Horace Greeley, Wade and Davis, and 20 other disgruntled Republicans, who began proceedings to replace Lincoln on the 64 ticket with Ulysses Grant. Receiving news of the conference, Lincoln sent Colonel John Eaton Jr. to Grant's headquarters at City Point, Virginia, to gauge his attitude about the possible nomination. Eaton kept his conversation with the general to military matters, but toward the end of the talk, he slipped in a comment about the DRAPT Ulysses movement.
"The question is not whether you wish to run, but whether you could be compelled to run in answer to the people."
Grant responded by slamming his fist on the table.
"They can't do it. They can't compel me to do it. I consider it as important to the cause that he should be elected as that the army should be successful in the field."
Grant was out, and when Lincoln was told of what the general had said, he sat back in his chair.
I told you that they could not get him to run until he had closed out the rebellion.
While Lincoln sorted out potential rivals, disturbing news from the battlefield continued to pour in. The siege of Petersburg showed no signs of breaking. General Sherman's advance on Atlanta stalled out as well. But there were also encouraging signs. On the 14th, in Dalton, Georgia, a Union garrison manned with 400 soldiers was brutally attacked by a 4,000-strong Confederate assault. The Union soldiers held out for days until reinforcements finally arrived. An assault by the 14th U.S. Colored Infantry on the rebel force dispersed the attackers and saved the fort. It was fitting that the gallantry of black troops would adorn the pages of the New York Times on the same day Frederick Douglass came to visit Lincoln at the White House. In his diary of that day, Douglass said Lincoln was alarmed at growing war opposition in the North, fueled by complaints that the Emancipation Proclamation had rendered it an abolition war.
The president was alarmed at growing war opposition in the North and was apprehensive that a peace might be forced upon him which would leave still in slavery all who had not come within our lines.
In anticipation of such an outcome, Lincoln authorized Frederick Douglass to form a band of scouts and go south to liberate as many slaves as he could. For Douglass, it was a sign Lincoln was becoming desperate. That night at the Soldiers' Home, Lincoln vented more frustrations about his untenable position to a former Wisconsin governor.
There are now between 1 and 200,000 black men in the service of the Union. There have been men who have proposed to me to return to slavery, the black warriors to conciliate the South. I should be damned in time and in eternity for so doing. No human power can subdue this rebellion without using the emancipation lever as I have done. My enemies condemn my emancipation policy. Let them prove by the history of this war that we can restore the Union without it.
Days later, Lincoln received a tempting offer from another New York newspaper editor, this time the New York Herald. Henry J. Raymond had been among the 20 who met in New York to discuss replacing Lincoln with Grant, but he decided to make a last effort to salvage Lincoln's wilting candidacy. On the 22nd, Raymond wrote to Lincoln,
"The tide is setting strongly against us. Were an election to be held now, we should be beaten. Two special causes are assigned to this great reaction in public sentiment: the want of military successes and the impression in some minds that we are not to have peace in any event under this administration until abolition is abandoned."
Lincoln could hardly argue with Raymond. 4 years of war with no end in sight. The impression that Lincoln cared more about ending slavery than saving the Union. It was all piling up that sticky August of '64. But Raymond proposed a way out of the quagmire.
Why would it not be wise to make distinct proffers of peace to Jefferson Davis on the sole condition of acknowledging the supremacy of the Constitution?
As Lincoln contemplated Raymond's offer, he stepped out onto the White House lawn to greet a regiment of demobilizing soldiers. The Ohio 166th had defended the Capitol throughout the bloody hot summer of '64, and now they were on their way home.
I feel inclined to give a few brief remarks on the importance of success in this contest. It is not merely for today, but for all time to come, that we should perpetuate for our children's children this great and free government, which we have enjoyed all our lives. The nation is worth fighting for, to secure such an inestimable jewel.
Lincoln may have thought that the Union was an inestimable jewel, yet for 4 years he'd seen the heavy price it cost to preserve it. Now it looked like abandoning the abolition of slavery would be included in that price. The next day, Lincoln called his cabinet to a meeting and passed around a sealed memorandum requiring his secretaries to sign it before reading it. Once they'd done so, Lincoln read his blind memorandum to the cabinet.
It seems increasingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards.
On the 23rd, Lincoln set about drafting a reply to Henry Raymond's offer to open peace negotiations with the Confederacy.
You will obtain a conference for peace with Honorable Jefferson Davis, or any person by him authorized for that purpose. You will propose, on behalf of this government, that upon the restoration of the Union and the national authority, the war shall cease at once.
It was perhaps Lincoln's lowest point. He was holding in his hands the paper that could stop the war. But what did peace mean if Lincoln was willing to throw away all the country had sacrificed for, all that had been struggled for, all the millions who relied on Lincoln to finish the work begun with emancipation would be lost? Lincoln folded up the letter and stuck it in a drawer. The next day, he had Raymond brought in for a meeting at the White House. As Lincoln's personal secretary, John Nicolay, recalled,
the president held a consultation with Raymond and showed him that they had thoroughly considered and discussed the proposition of his letter and readily concurred that sending a commission to Richmond would be worse than losing the presidential contest. It would be ignominiously surrendering it in advance.
As much as Raymond had urged Lincoln to abandon abolition as a condition of peace, he left with an uncanny sense that despite his own feelings on the issue, Lincoln clearly knew what he was talking about. Raymond backed off, still concerned Lincoln's intransigence on slavery was going to cost him the election, but willing to fall in line. Lincoln may have neutralized yet another threat to his candidacy, but convincing the American people he was worth re-electing was going to be another matter. On the last day of August 1864, the Democratic Party offered a light at the end of the long and bloody tunnel of war. The Chicago Platform, as it became known, outlined a pathway to peace without abolition as a condition. It would be a tempting platform for an American public sick of war and sick of Lincoln. But Democrats were shrewd enough to understand that an excessively anti-war campaign could easily open the party up to charges of lacking patriotism or even treason. To counterbalance these concerns, a former Union general, George B. McClellan, was placed at the top of the ticket. As head of the Army of the Potomac, McClellan had continually and publicly clashed with Lincoln on military strategy. Lincoln, frustrated by McClellan's hesitating nature, accused his general of having a case of the slows. McClellan called Lincoln the original guerrilla.
God damn! This guy gets it.
Few opponents would be better positioned to criticize Lincoln's war policy. McClellan had built the army and was fired twice by the administration over disagreements on how to conduct the war. Now McClellan wanted a reinstatement via the ballot box, and with a promotion to commander-in-chief. The nomination of McClellan on a Democratic peace platform was a bad sign. With 2 months until Election Day and prospects looking dim, Lincoln regretfully resigned himself to fate.
My own experience has proven to me that the Democratic Party program will result in the dismemberment of the Union. The slightest acquaintance with arithmetic will prove to any man that the rebel armies cannot be destroyed with the Democratic strategy. I cannot help but feel that the future of this great nation will be decided in the approaching canvass.
Okay, so Lincoln thought he was going to lose, but we know that Lincoln ended up winning that election, so what happened in the interim? Well, on August 31st, when George McClellan was nominated as the Democratic Party candidate for president, the city of Atlanta was evacuated. Several days later, word came from Georgia that General Sherman had captured the city. This victory breathed new life into the Union cause and gave Americans a sense that maybe they ought to sustain their commander-in-chief. The sudden upswelling of war fever in the North forced McClellan to disavow his own party's platform, committing to continuing fighting the war. And this left McClellan looking a bit wishy-washy. Lincoln ended up winning the 1864 election in a landslide, though he did not win McClellan's home state of New Jersey, nor did he win his own home state of Kentucky. Nevertheless, Lincoln won his victory, and by January of 1865, the 13th Amendment, banning involuntary servitude except as punishment of a crime, was signed by the President and sent off to the states for ratification.